I should also add that this is Bob Hinchelwood and this is Rex Haig, and if you don't know who they are, you should. They are past presidents of the Association of Therapeutic Communities, which is what we're here to discuss, which is 40 years old. I don't actually know what the date was. Anyway, and it also happens to be 40 years since I first set foot in the Henderson as a sociology community, so it's a double 40 for me, which is, I just thought I'd say a couple of things about leadership and charisma and authority. As some of you may or may not know, I'm a sociologist. I don't have any clinical skills at all, and I've been dipping in and out of the therapy community movement for the last 40 years, and I've always brought my own view of that, and that's a view from sociology. And what sociology has to say about therapeutic communities and the therapeutic community movement essentially is that it's a group or a network of people who are trying to change the world in some way or other, but it's doing it with a set of values which are often at odds with those within which it is swimming. These may be professional values or economic values, or indeed just the kind of prejudices you find in the everyday world around you. And from a sociological point of view, that raises a problem, is how do you manage the internal life of this organisation or network if it's in tension with the outside world? And the answer is you do it through leadership. In other words, someone, and often in this case it's embodied in a way through the president of the ATC, or has been embodied, has to both articulate internally what the point of this organisation is, its goals and aspirations, and also to kind of stave off or interface or push away or negotiate with the outside world. Now that's done, I've drawn unashamedly on a guy called Max Weber, who's a German sociologist, late 19th, early 20th century, to suggest that the qualities you need, and I think we've got them sitting here either side of me, are an element of charisma. Max Weber defines authority, which you need in terms of being able to be accepted as a legitimate leader by a group or a network. He defines authority in three ways. You probably know this, some of you. It's rational and legal, and that's the kind of authority you get when you're elected in an election. There's traditional authority, it's the way it's always been, and I'm an old buffer who, as it were, I'm not actually, I hope, but I could be, who exercise authority because we've always done it like that. And then the third kind of authority is what he calls charismatic authority, and that's exercised through the personal, sometimes almost magical, but certainly personal characteristics of the individual who exemplifies and embodies a kind of transformative energy which they bring to a network or group and help to give themselves, and people will give to them, the space to exercise certain kinds of power, productive power, I think, through that authority, which what we call leadership, really, in many ways. I think Max Weber got that right. The trouble with the three forms of authority is one of them is unstable, it's a bit like a radioactive isotope, but charisma is an unstable element. It tends to decay over time, either towards rational legal authority or to traditional authority. And retaining when that happens, it often changes the very nature of the thing that you're organising. So that he argued that charisma doesn't last, and the problem for the ATC and the problem for therapeutic communities is the continual replenishment of charisma to interface between a possibly hostile outside world and a kind of an attempt to create something on the inside, and that's the succession problem. So I thought I'd open with those few comments to ask, how has that, I mean, in a sense, against what I think.
Lots of things to think about and pin down. The high spot for me, for my own thinking about it all, was back when I was talking at a TC conference when yet another TC was playing, Greenwoods in Essex, I think, and they had a big conference in a marquee, and was anybody there for that?
In a rainstorm.
In a terrific rainstorm. And it's just the one paper I thought I said what I wanted to. I don't think I've ever said what I wanted to quite before, because I find it so difficult to articulate it, put it into words. And I'm just picking up on the Weber thing. I think what I said was there's three sorts of, there seem to be three sorts of, what did I call it? Ways of operating in the NHS, I think I was saying. And there was traditional, the old medical, Lancelot Spratt sort of consultant lording it over people. And I imagine Maxwell Jones was a bit like that. I don't know, but that's in my fantasy. It was a bit like that. And that was his sort of charisma in a way. And then there was the administrative way, which we seem to be in the, the high age of at the moment. Then, this was 12 years ago or so, and how everything gets terribly bureaucratized and institutionalized, and that's a complete anathema to me. It makes it impersonal and makes it mechanical and stuff like that. And then the third one, I said, then there is therapeutic, and that is what therapeutic communities do. They think about things, they ask everything that comes up, they look at it afresh and say, well, is that the right way to do it? And funnily enough, I'm just reading a book at the moment on Google, on how Google was founded, and the answer, according to this author, is they were both Montessori kids. They didn't take anything for granted, and they said, well, is that the best way to do it? Let's think of other ways of doing it. And I thought, well, that's similar to that therapeutic way of looking at things. Don't accept anything as it is, always ask about it. And I think in that paper, when I was saying those things, I just captured what I wanted to say about TCs. And as I say, I never had time to write it up and get it published or anything like that, but I just felt I'd said what I needed to at that point, and I don't think I ever have since, really. But it just, when you're saying about Weber, it sounds to me like similar sort of types of charisma. Now, charisma, I was really offended when Penny Campling said to me I was charismatic. I thought, no, I'm not. I don't want to be sort of like, that out there and all that stuff. But then I sort of thought about it, perhaps, and I think I called her bossy in return, actually. I said, well, you're bossy, Penny, I'm charismatic or something. And I haven't, so, I mean, that was a direct encounter with sort of the charisma word, as it were. But when I did the Maxwell Jones lecture in 2004, I remember grabbing that theme and saying, it's not the person that's charismatic in TC world as I see it, it's the ideas that are charismatic. And that's really similar to David Kennard's idea of it'll pop up again in another form somehow, however you try and squash it down, just sort of being human together in groups, doing stuff together, living, learning, culture of inquiry, all that stuff. It's just bound to pop up in some way, because it's an inevitable life force of humans and the way they work in groups and stuff. And so it's that idea and making that work in some way or other, in a mental health setting or in a prison or in a social service or whatever sort of setting, or school, whatever. I mean, it's inevitable that it'll pop and work. And the forces of what Google would call evil try and suppress it the whole time. And I think that's the battle we're in forever, as it were. And, I think it's particularly grim in the NHS at the moment. Everybody saw my latest sort of thing round to the TC group. But I think the days of TCs in the NHS are very sorely unnumbered. They've seen off the residential ones, and I don't think the day ones have got more than a decade to live in their current form, or in any form, actually, unless we sort of fight on a different front somehow. And I think that I find that very tiring, but energizing to think it's a fight against the forces of evil the whole time. It's almost like a sort of Star Wars sort of theme, isn't it? That's a sort of, but another bit of it to put in the story of leadership and things. The leader when I got involved in TCs was Jeff Roberts. He was chair-president of ATC at the time, and they couldn't find a secretary, so I volunteered to be secretary and sort of slowly learned what ATC was up to through being secretary for a year or two. And I remember the first conference I went to, which was at Green College in Oxford in those days. Jeff gave a very sort of impassioned, colourful speech about the tide is going out, that's it folks, good night, last one out, turn the lights off please. And I thought, what have I joined here? This is miserable. And it did feel like that throughout that was 89, so throughout the 90s it really did feel rather like that. It doesn't feel quite like that now, but I suppose my hopes are in not TCs as we know them, but that TC impulse, as David called it, resurfacing in other ways, and I think I can see that happening. and we've got to not be precious about it, saying this is the only way to do TCs, because if we do that, we'll be just laughed out of court really and taken no notice of. But it's teaming up with other people and doing it in different ways. Jan and I came up with an expression for it when we were talking with somebody a couple of weeks ago about the Jessica Kingsley book series and stuff, and we said we are the Pomo Dinos, because in a way we're the dinosaurs of the generation, but we're also trying to be postmodern about it, in that nothing is the right way to do it. There's all sorts of different answers, as opposed to the what was the other one she came up with? The Pomo Dinos and the Dodo Dinos, who are the authoritarian old sorts who just sort of, this is the only way to do it. Oh well, it's gone now. That's very sad. Sort of. So there's a few random thoughts to following your
Pomo and Dodos.
Pomo Dinos and Dodo Dinos.
I came with absolutely no thoughts about what I wanted to say, except some general sort of sense of, oh God, the ATC is really sort of on the way out, and it's perhaps actually disappeared, and I haven't quite got it clear whether the ATC has disappeared, metamorphosed into this new, what is it?
TCTC, yeah.
Yes, several TCs.
I can give a bit of detail on that in a minute if you want.
Yes, well, I can think about that. And it's quite, so I sort of tend to respond to what Nick and Rex have been saying, particularly what Rex was saying. I never can say the things I really want to say. That's the frustration of life, isn't it? But I suppose in listening to them, what I want to say, if I get it out properly, is about leadership, that it's always set up as some sort of characteristic, some set of attributes that somebody has, whether it's one or other of the three kinds that Nick was filching from Max Weber. I don't know about Max Weber, but the thing I learnt, I think it's learning, particularly from the Tavistock and the Leicester conferences, is there's no leadership without followership. And the capacity of a leader to lead only depends on the willingness of those he leads to allow him the leadership. It came from Rich Rollinson, who also isn't here. I remember him saying, Gandhi said, I am the leader of my people. My people are on the move. I must follow them. And it seemed to me a very important dialectic that one has to remember, that where there's a leader, there have to be people who follow. And this makes it a bit more complicated than just having the right attributes of knowledge or of an appointed role, or this mysterious charisma, which I think is religious, isn't it, actually? But that's why Rex didn't like it. It means grace, doesn't it? The grace of God. I wouldn't want that either. So it seems to me it's important to be excessively simplistic, and I'm sure this will make Nick squirm. There are different properties of this relationship between leaders and followers. One is what's called a top-down relationship, where people imagine leaders as those people who decide what to do, and they tell the followers who go away and do it under penalty of losing a job or something like that. And there's bottom-up relationship, where there is a liveliness that comes from the bottom, which has then to be coordinated and formed into some kind of sensible way forward by the leader or those who lead. You can give a lecture on top down and bottom up in a minute, but it always seems to be a good little paradigm to think about this, that we have to have both some top down stuff and some bottom up stuff. The community, when I came into the therapeutic community, which was actually 40 years ago, I remember, here's an old man speaking, I remember 40 years ago, it was at Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridge when David Clark, nobody remembers David Clark, I suppose, in this generation, good, stood up. He was the charismatic director of Fulbourn Hospital and said, we must start an association. Everybody should give £1 and become a member of the, what should we call it, he said, and then there was a discussion about what we called it. But I was there in those days. And it seems to me that the ATC has been this sort of organisation which has tried to represent a bottom-up approach to the provision of psychiatric health, mental health, care in the community or whatever. Bottom-upness. In those early days, it was so extreme that it was really overbalanced, and no meeting with the ATC would have happened like this. By now there would have been somebody who was saying, why are we doing it like this? Why are those three stuck up there? And why aren't we all joining in properly so that there's a proper dialogue? But no, you've got this top-down approach with Nick and Rex and me spouting at you, even though we don't know what we say, and if we did, we couldn't say it.
So, well, that's a very good linking, as they say on Radio 4 in the mornings, to opening it up for discussion. It's true, actually, that I did suggest to Gary that we should just have a large group setting with no... So we compromise with this semi-hierarchical, semi-group setting. Really opening it up to the floor. Comments?
But just to, in defence of Gary perhaps, that this kind of structuring is very much what's in the air, what you're saying, swimming in the culture. We can't but swim in the culture that we are part of in a bigger sense. And so we absorb that and we become structured in this way.
Some thoughts on your opening remarks, and I think what you're talking about in the first few sentences is something about the open system and the community being an open system which has strong boundary management. So you know that sort of idea about a membrane, you're allowing things to filter in and keeping other things out. And I was thinking, joining the Cotswold community in 1982 as a sort of 22-year-old with Richard Balburney as the principal, who was an ex-army chap, and really had a sort of charismatic authority, and it was probably quite a frightening guy at times. And there's something about his boundary management, and he called it dynamic administration or running interference, whereby he was very aggressive in the management of the Cotswold community, to the point whereby one day Wiltshire County Council sent an inspection group to the community to visit and see the quality of work, and he refused to let them onto the site. He said, you don't understand this work, you're not coming in. He felt he'd probably fight them to the death for at the boundary, literally. And I suppose that sort of open systems model, the boundary management model, was always the model I internalised, something about you're holding a boundary, you're providing that sort of filtering in across a semi-permanent boundary as a planning model. But I think something's changed, and I think now the risk was, I think, that therapeutic communities did or could become insular and introverted, and had to open up to more mainstream and external regulatory bodies, for example, Ofsted. So currently at the Multibridge School, although we're a community, we are registered and monitored by Ofsted, and they do an annual care inspection, and if we don't get outstanding, if we get good or satisfactory, it affects our marketing, our promotion, and we're waiting for our Ofsted next year, which is with care and education together. And our anxiety again is if we don't get outstanding, somehow maybe we won't get referrals. So that's for me, it's something about moving from the open system model to something more about complex adaptive systems. It feels as though these boundaries are now far more fluid, and the administration or boundary management that's required has to be in a way more nuanced. You can't help but let people in or things in which you don't like, and then you have to sort of say to yourself, what is it about here? What is it about the anti-authority part of me that doesn't want Ofsted in? The same time accept without Ofsted, we can't promote ourselves as a school that is doing well and get referrals from local authorities. So I think in the last 10 years something has really shifted, and so my sort of internal concept of boundary management and leadership and the way that's administered in terms of a very fluid world now is very different. I just want to say that because something about what has changed and how it has become more mainstream in both NHS and sort of the private or charity sectors as well. It feels a very different world, and it's far more fluid, and the boundaries far more open, and there's more people putting their heads in, and more risk, but also more safety in some ways as a result of Ofsted and child protection and all the other regulatory bodies which keep an eye on the work. I just wanted to sort of
I wanted to say something very similar, which is more about the locus of the authority, because I felt, to some extent, when we talk about charismatic leadership, or whether it's rational, legal, traditional, or charismatic, we're talking about the leadership qualities of an individual. And I think increasingly, basically, absolutely what you're saying, John, is that the authority is not in individuals any longer. The authority is in some amorphous mass where no one is responsible, it seems. There is no one person who you seem to be able to go to who is responsible for a decision. I mean, I find, even in my small environment, that when I'm managing a small team of staff, it's not what I believe that team should be doing that I'm telling them to do, it's what I'm being told that I have to tell them to do. And so in a sense, I don't even feel I have any, even though I have an authority, I feel I have no authority at all. And the more senior you become, the less authority that you have in order to make real decisions that affect people, and to be able to communicate or respond to bottom-up movements, or it's all top-down. And I think in that middle management, you were talking about top-down leadership and bottom-up, but it's the people in the middle often, many of us sitting here, who just get crushed in the middle of all of that by having absolutely no authority at all.
Wait.
Can I pick up something
Let us have
this?
this.
Having recently stepped down from full-time work, and it just occurred to me here that the first time not being in some kind of leadership role for, if we're talking numbers of years, quite a lot of years. And I think what I was going to say is that it's whatever system that you're in, your group or organisation, generates the desire for the performance of leadership. And so the leader gets invited into, partly by on their own account, partly by whoever it is that they're supposedly to lead, invited to perform a leadership function and to use authority in that. And the leader has perhaps more experience or knowledge or something that you develop, the more you can exercise. But the leader actually has a choice as to how to deploy that and perform that role. Because I'm thinking in some settings I performed it in one way to do with what I perceive to be the nature of the group, the nature of the task, and the nature of the environment. And in other settings I performed it in a very different way. But it's always difficult, because you're always, no one's going to make it easy for you. That's not why you're there, to have other people make your life easy, because you're always in that interpretive role between the pastor's up there and the pastor's down there, or however you want to see it, but you're always in that pinch. And so it is so this business of charisma is, I think, one of the elements which goes into the performance of that role, because it's a personal performance as well as a technical performance, and that is the bit which is unstable. I'm not sure about the idea of it decaying. I think, well, it's decaying, but it can decay in all sorts of directions, because we can all think, and if pushed, name certain charismatic leaders who caused huge damage, actually, because they got over-invested in their own performance as charismatic leader. And just at the other end of that spectrum, there was a time, it was 20 years ago, when I got involved in one of these sets of communications with Russia. I was in the Russian Federation, talking about some of this stuff. And we used the term charismatic, and they had no idea what we meant by it. Probably partly because it is that religious connotation, race and so on. And so they said, well, give us an example. What do you mean by a charismatic leader? So 20 years ago we said, well, Gorbachev, he's a charismatic leader. Him, bastard. He wasn't a charismatic, he was just trouble to them at that particular moment. And they said, oh, Thatcher? And we thought, oh God, yes, probably. So it's a very, very loaded and unstable term, let alone a performance of it. I know Bob and I've thought about this a great deal, but I think it's that there's a kind of unsolvable dilemma in the middle of it.
Somebody to go on, I'm beginning to think Max Weber's locking us into boxes that are rather inflexible. And I think the key thing is what John said, which is complex adaptive systems, not systems, I don't know what systems are, complex adaptive working we have to do. And there's a word that, you've got it's gone now, but John Ritton was on there. And I wonder what sort of leader he was. It feels to me that him and Howard Bridge were facilitatory rather than charisma may come in, but I think that was placed on them rather than them being it. And I think charisma's in the eye of the beholder rather than actually in the person. And the task is always, as you were saying, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but is to actually adapt to the situation you're in and to provide a model that suits, that carries out the task. Howard Bridger will be saying that, and I'm sure many other people will be. But you have to, you're always in a situation where there's feeling that you're out of control, the powers out there are too much, the staff don't want to work with you. There's always, and you have to be flexible and adaptable and use whatever tools you have at your disposal. I mean, I've always disliked the bell bin leadership thing, which is always means that if I'm one particular type of person, I can be that, and everybody else has to do the rest of it. Nonsense, the leader has to be everything.
Can I just say that the word that you use, fluidity, the idea that we're in a more fluid situation, I think that kind of, that is a word that I would, want to sort of point up in a way, because when you're talking about leadership, you seem to be talking about one person being charismatic, one person being a leader. Isn't leadership, perhaps, isn't it a more powerful thing if it's diffused in a whole group, and that all group members should have the opportunity to feel or to have those skills of leading? I mean, how would you see that? Because you've talked a lot about, Weber's idea of leadership. Doesn't charismatic leadership, in that sense, if it's embodied in one person or a society allows that, end up the rational legal? It devolves down to that. So better to have a sort of a diffused kind of leadership. Is that possible, or?
I don't know.
Or not you? Everybody?
Certainly that's one of the people I look to. His name's gone out of my head at the moment, but talked about leadership as in developing leaders. In other words, people you're working with, your task as a leader to ensure that they become leaders.
Yeah, I was thinking of everyone being, when you were talking about fluidity, and I was thinking of Ofsted being such an imposition. If we were all less passive, I think everybody here has probably been checked and assessed, etc. And we are rather passive about it. If we were able to say, well, actually, I'm not sure you are Ofsted, but I don't think you're right there. that almost seems like a revolution, but shouldn't we have that revolution? Talk back.
Yeah, Gary. Yeah, go on.
Task for me. Just thinking about is it the leader or do people identify with the task and focus on the task? And my gut feeling is there's something about therapeutic community work, which is about relationships and about group work, and it has that humanity which people want to identify with, no matter who is the leader.
Yeah, so just diffuse.
The primary task is actually what carries people, leads people, takes people.
This radical idea that the task should be kind of held, or there should be less leadership and more kind of bottom-upness, as you're saying, that's always been the idea. Just coming back to Adrian's point about Thatcher as a charismatic leader, and the question, so when people come in 200 or 300 years' time, when people look at the kind of radical lurches in psychiatry, they'll look back to the mid-20th century, to the mid-late 20th century, the most radical upheaval in psychiatry, the therapeutic community movement, with a number of iconographic sort of figures, and they'll look at the organisation that was kind of holding the banner, and what they'll see is this contradiction then, because I can't remember who was the chair before Jeff Roberts, but apart from Rex kind of with the Taliban, these are the most recent figures, including Kevin Healy. Who was before Jeff?
Melvin,
yeah.
Oh, was he the chair?
Yeah.
So apart from Melvin, who I don't think was a psychiatrist, was he?
No.
So, but this later history then, the history dominated by men in positions of power and authority. So this idea that there's this kind of, this radical spirit, but nonetheless the ATC has been led by something very traditional, albeit
every one of them is a psychiatrist as well, yeah.
But all psychiatrists and all men. So I just came back to Fiona's point about, is there a difference, or Adrian's point about Thatcher come Meryl Streep, the sort of, is it, do we think, do you think that something might have been different? Have we had a different kind of character? Is there a gender charisma? So have we had a kind of, like you're talking about, male figures? And on the first page there, when I was looking at the kind of history of the ATC, all the journal editors historically have been men, haven't they? So this kind of gender imbalance, I think.
Just feedback. I pointed out that in the ATC meetings this summer that the majority of people who were speaking were men. The women were keeping very quiet, apart from occasional women like Sarah, who's and I was very quickly pointed out that I should be looking further around my own personal view on that. In other words, is it my problem? And I felt very strongly that actually that domination still continues.
Okay, you get a chance to say something in a couple more minutes, and then we're going to have a wrap up because we've only got 45 minutes for each of these, so we have to. Other comments from the floor, people who haven't spoken?
One thing
John,
that went through my mind is that part of the kind of tension is that one of the key ideas in therapeutic communities is about democracy, and the leadership necessarily is sort of clashing with that somehow, or at odds with it. And the other thought I had was that generally it seems to me that there might be designated leaders in any particular group, but there'll be challenges to that leadership, and there'll be different people emerging as leaders for different particular tasks or at different times, or trying to take over in some way, not necessarily as a sort of named leader, but somehow as the person that's got the power to kind of drive the agenda. And the third thing I thought was sort of more specifically about the ATC. My feeling is that since Rex stepped down, we haven't had a leader. And I think that we're closing the ATC because there's been no leadership.
On that note, we could do some wrap-up comments on Rex. You've been dying to say all sorts of things.
I'm just confused by too many thoughts now. I've really said those things. Oh, it's so complex. But let me look forward a bit instead. And I think the new TCTC organisation is, I hope, again, sorry, I get lost as I say this. I hope it's going to be very different, and I hope there's. Well, let me just say a few practical things rather than try and get philosophical or vague about it. The main person who's holding it all together is, as far as I can see, a very well-organised manager rather than a leader. That's Susan Williams, who isn't here today, but I think several people know her through the work she's done at Christchurch Deal and things. And she to me is providing, in terms of organisational business structure, all those sorts of things that are absolute anathema to me. She's providing the sort of foundations it never had in my time as ATC anyway. And I'm balking against decisions all the time because it's not open and free enough. And she's saying, no, we've got to do this first before you start thinking about those wild ideas and stuff. And although I feel quite resistant to it as one of the people on the little group that's trying to transfer, as it were, from ATC to the new TCTC, I think maybe that's what the world we have to live in now is, with that sort of leadership. But I do think I don't want to lose that spirit of Google that I'm reading about at the moment, which is questioning why is it this way, to the level of why is Ofsted this way, why is the Royal College this way, telling Sarah what to do all the time, why are what are these things that are stopping that therapeutic impulse happening, that we're, what are we up against really? What is it that we're up against, and how can we effectively do something about what we're up against? I've gone all vague again, but I think this leadership and making sure that finances and the business side of the new TCTC are in place is something that has sort of shocked me with, not shocked me, but sort of rattled me, because it's not letting us be free to do the things I think the organisation should do. And I think in there's something different something of the difference between leadership and management. I mean, management is something I just don't understand. I don't think I'm any good at, but I can see that I've got ideas and stuff I want to tell people about, and maybe that's what part of leadership is. And I want to argue against things, and I want to ask those questions: why are we doing it this way? Why can't we do it differently? About everything, really.
And I'm going to wrap up with the last couple of comments in response to that a little bit. There is an interesting book by Amitai Etzioni called Complex Organisations, in which he argued, to answer your question, that, for example, the Catholic Church is a very successful organisation because it has some people who do charisma and some people who do business, and it manages to combine. Usually the young priests are running around South America being charismatic, and there's a lot of accountants back in the Vatican counting the pennies, and that works very well. And his suggestion is you need people in both roles. So you need a charismatic leader, and you need Susan, who is a business consultant, doing business, and that's using a division of labour, at least for those two things. So what I set up originally was an artificial design to provoke you, and I think that's what the new TCTC needs to attend to. Is it's got someone like Susan Williams doing the business, and I think that's very helpful. But it needs a sort of public face and inspirational, motivational person to lead it, who can be absolutely hopeless at management because that's getting done elsewhere. And I think that's commonly now what's called distributed leadership and those sorts of things in modern organisations, is that you transact with the boundaries with management, and you stimulate and motivate, and you envision where you're going from the leadership. And one final observation, that we've just started a new blog in the Institute. Janelle here is one of the people who's been setting that up. And one of my colleagues posted a blog about Steve Jobs. And it basically, Ruth works in the business school but also in mental health, and she was saying, how did Steve Jobs do what he did with Apple? What was his secret? One of the observations she made is that Apple was a notoriously secret, or is a notoriously secret organisation, so we don't know what's going on, although we do now know that it's causing people to jump off roofs at Foxconn in China and kill themselves, and so on. But he was notoriously secret, and she said the word on the street about Jobs was that if you Googled the words Jobs and arsehole, you've got many, many, many hits, and he was regarded, he's charismatic to us, but he was regarded internally as an arsehole, a very controlling person. And my final anecdote on that, you may have heard this one, is that when they were developing the iPad, or the iPhone, I can't remember which, when they were trying to micro-miniaturize everything. Some eager technician came to his office and said, look, I've made this tiny thing that does all these things. And he just took it and said, okay. And he walked across to the fish tank in his office and dropped it in it. And some bubbles came up and he said, there's still space in there, it's not small enough yet. And, which is an interesting way of leading your organisation. But we have to stop there, that's just to get us going, and I'll hand all my authority and leadership back to Gary. Okay. So thank you.